It's January 28th, 2021, and this is Mediation, the New Possibilities Hour. Our special guest today is Grace Hanson. Grace is the Chief Claims Officer for Hiscox Insurance Company Ltd. In her role, she manages the global claims function for over 5 business units, writing in multiple countries. Grace worked her way up to this prestigious position through working at a number of other high-profile insurance companies in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Bermuda. For those of you not familiar with Hiscox, it is an Anglo-Bermudan insurance provider listed on the London Stock Exchange. It's an underwriter at Lloyds of London, one of the largest. The company largely specializes in niche areas of the market, offering property and casualty insurance aimed at companies and high net worth individuals, as well as cover against such risks as hacking, kidnapping, and satellite damage. The company is listed on the London Stock Exchange. It's a constituent of the FTSE 250 index. Grace, we're so happy to have you today. As you know, this is a fundraiser. We don't charge for these great webinars. We ask people to contribute to food banks if they like what they see. And Jean, you've been keeping a running total of how much has been contributed since Natalie Armstrong-Motin started this wonderful series, the Will Work for Food Project, back in the spring of 2020. Jean, would you please fill us in on our progress to date, how generous our audiences have been?
Sure, Jeff, and it's great to see everyone. Some of you I haven't seen in ages, so thanks so much for joining us. As of today, $70,360 US. In addition to that, $1,560 US, as Natalie said already, for the Trussell Trust, just since you put that in your LinkedIn post. So
fantastic. Perfect. Thank you, Jean. So as stated in the chat, and as you just stated, the food bank closest to Grace's heart is the Trussell Trust, TRUSSELTRUST.org, based in the United Kingdom. And Grace, you're up. The floor is yours, my friend. Please tell us a bit about the Trussell Trust. And we have a fabulous array of lawyers as well as mediators online, eager to hear you unravel the mysteries of the London market. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. Well, I am not a member of the Trussell Trust, but Hiscox Foundation has picked it as its charity of choice. And what the Trussell Trust, it's a tongue twister, does is it ensures that donations are spread evenly throughout the country to all of the food banks that need funds. And you know, it's interesting because I was just speaking to somebody recently about the value of food banks in the UK. And in the UK, there's actually quite a significant population that are below the poverty line. And it particularly impacts children because children, when school's in session, they usually get at least one good meal at lunchtime at school free. And now that we don't have school, the UK is in complete lockdown. Schools have been closed, which means children are at home. And if their families don't have food to give them, they don't, they go hungry. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and any donations to the Trust would be really appreciated. So Jeff asked me to speak about mediation in London, I think was the exact words. And I do have a little short PowerPoint. Let me just see here if I can pull it up here. Okay. What should mediators know about, hold on, about London? Well, first of all, it's more than London. It's really about Lloyds of London. And Lloyds of London is, of course, an institution that many of you have heard about. I had heard about it, but until I went to London, I didn't actually understand how different it was from what I had experienced in the United States. And I also didn't understand the dynamics of it. And I particularly didn't understand the dynamics of dispute resolution, alternate dispute resolution in the London market, and how complicated that could be. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details around this because I don't really think that that's probably appropriate, and I'm probably the last person to know the ins and outs of it, but I thought it would be interesting for you to hit on a few key terms. First, there are so many terms. There's actually a glossary online for Lloyd's. So for those of you who want to poke around, you can poke around there. The important things are that there are members or capacity providers for the market, and then there are managing agents. Hiscox is a managing agent. It actually, believe it or not, it's Syndicate 33, which is where it writes most of its business, is the oldest syndicate still in existence at Lloyds of London. And it used to be that members of the market could only be individuals or names. You may have heard of that. And my CEO, Bronik Masahato, when he was working at McKinsey years ago, was the first to actually articulate the proposition that companies could become members of the Lloyd's market. That was huge, and it created a sea change in terms of the amount of capital that's available. And now actually companies form the majority of the capital that is there, and most of the managing agents are run by companies. Syndicates are sort of like P&L. I think of it as like subsidiaries of a managing agent. Some managing agents only have one, some have multiple ones. Hiscox has 3. But what it really is part of the fabric of what makes mediation, really dispute resolution, again, complicated. So what actually makes it different from a mediator's point of view? And I'm going to give you some examples, and I also give you some idea of how really every mediation is going to be a bit the same. So the first thing is, I just went through those definitions. And so this first question, who has the authority, which was always challenging even in America, making sure you get somebody at the mediation who has the authority to close the deal, make the decision. Well, you can only imagine how complicated that is in a situation where you might have a representative from the syndicate, you might have a representative from a managing agent, you might have multiple layers. And just as an example, in Lloyd's, the way business is written is it's a marketplace, and it literally is a marketplace. It's like going into a market. If you go into the Lloyd's building, and each syndicate or managing agent has its own box. They call it a box. And when I first got to Hiscox, they would have these box meetings, and I would go, what's a box? What's a box meeting? And it's really a stand-up, but they have a little box, and their underwriters sit there. And what happens is brokers walk around, and they get people to sign on to a slip. And the slip is basically a fairly bare bones summary of the risk that's being written. It sometimes has policy wording attached to it. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it refers to a form. So for those of you who are as old as I am and remember the World Trade Center, you may remember there's a huge dispute about wording on a slip which never made it to a form, and it was a Willis property slip. And there was a debate about, was there one occurrence or 2 occurrences? And the debate arose because essentially there was never a memorialized document. That happens a lot, and it makes dispute resolution very complicated, where there's a coverage issue or you want to understand the scope of what's been insured, because essentially you don't have a clear outline of exactly, what's covered. And so when you have a slip like that, you have a lead underwriter, and sometimes you have a second lead, and you might have as many as 29, 30 players on a particular risk. Often those players delegate their authority to the lead or the second lead. Sometimes they don't. They may disagree. So when you go into a mediation and you have a party in front of you, you don't know. You have to make sure that that party actually has authority. So from the perspective of someone who actually wants to ensure that the dispute resolution mechanism is effective, it means you have to do a lot of pre-work. And that pre-work is to understand exactly who are the power players, who's involved, how complicated is it, how many layers of authority are there, because otherwise you're not going to be able to effectively make any decisions about who's the appropriate person to actually be having a discussion with. The other thing that you're going to find is there's an extended list of stakeholders and trusted advisors. What does that really mean? Well, in the London market, there is a heavy reliance on external counsel. That external counsel often has local counsel. And when I first really understood this was actually when I was a US lawyer. Was defending one of the parties, and it was a warehouse that had burned down, and there was a US carrier who insured the building, and Lloyd's insured the inventory of the building. And there were 28 lawyers involved, 28 different parties. And we went to at least 4 different mediations. We were never able to resolve the portion of the claim that related to the inventory, that related to Lloyd's. First, because there were so many parties involved. Second, because the party that appeared at the mediation, the lawyer who appeared at the mediation, rarely had authority and was essentially just kind of a mouthpiece. And so you need to make sure that you have the trusted advisor, the important person who's going to have the most influence. Again, to me, that's all about pre-work, probing. And often the lawyers don't want to admit that they don't have authority, but they really don't. Or they don't want to admit that their view really isn't necessarily going to be the view of other participants on the slip. The other thing that you're going to find, I think, with London market is it has a strange dichotomy of experience. So it's really impressive the level of sophistication that people have for certain types of business. I mean, they are involved in underwriting this business around the world. So if it's a mining loss, for instance, they've done mining losses all over the world. They understand different jurisdictions. They're highly specialized. They're very focused. But yet at the same time, they're often somewhat naive about the local dynamics. And I see this often when we are involved in mediations, and I have representatives from the London market, which is the Hiscox London market, present. And they often look to their outside lawyers to give them a view of what the local environment. And so as a mediator, you have to influence, I think, that local presence to be able to pass on the right message and give that right information while understanding how sophisticated these people are. I've actually been shocked at how sophisticated they are. Most of them aren't lawyers, actually, in the Lloyd's market on the claim side. You also have to understand they view themselves not as claims people. So in American culture anyway, my perspective has always been claims people were a bit of a secondhand, citizen, underwriters, depending on the company. Sometimes were involved in the dispute resolution, but rarely. But in the London market, they actually call claims people claims underwriters, that they go in, their job is to essentially underwrite the claim value, and they take that very seriously. The London market also works very, very slowly. It is something they're trying to work hard to change, but it has not changed much. And I have had many a conversation with the head of claims for London market who reports to me about, and he will say to me, Grace, it's different here. For 2 years, we've had that conversation. It's really different here. And it really is different. So when you are trying to dispute with London market, I think there needs to be an understanding that it's going to be a long process. It may involve multiple mediations. It may involve multiple conversations. Again, that could just be pre-work, but it needs to happen. And if you think that people are going to just get in a room and resolve the issue one time out, it's unlikely, simply because of the factors I've already discussed, but also because I think they are inherently slower to make decisions, perhaps because so many parties are involved. So even if a lead has authority, he's still accountable in a sense to everyone else on the slip. He has a fiduciary responsibility to some degree to everybody else on the slip. He also has a fiduciary duty to the market. And I've already talked a little bit about the delegation of authority. I want to just touch on culture. I've been to mediations in different countries and involving different parties. When I was in Bermuda, we actually had a blended form. Sometimes it dictated New York law and arbitration. Sometimes it dictated UK law and arbitration. And sometimes it didn't. It just said arbitration, and it had a choice of law provision. And I've found that culturally, mediations in the UK are different from mediations that I had when I was in Bermuda and mediations that I had in America. In America, I think Americans are kind of pragmatic. They know for the most part, they're trying to go in, trying to resolve it, and they tend to be more emotionally engaged. At least that's been my experience, in the process. I found that the British to be quite hard to read. They don't like demonstrating, their emotions in the same way. They use different language, more coded language. And they're unlikely to tell you they don't like something. I think there's a famous joke that they'll say, "Oh, that's interesting," which is just code for, what you're saying makes no sense, and I don't agree with it. Whereas to me, that's interesting. I view it as, oh, they're thinking about it, and so it's. I think it's important to understand that, because I didn't understand it, and I made mistakes just even in my role often because I underestimated the degree of opposition and the degree of disagreement, because it wasn't externally expressed in the way that I expected it to be externally expressed, in a more forthright way that you see with Americans. And I did actually two that mediations I was personally involved in. Again, most of them are done by people, sort of in my team in the UK. There was also another dynamic which you don't see in the US, and that is the relationship between the solicitor and the barrister. So if you have your UK mediation, you're going to see both your solicitor and your barrister in a mediation, and both of them play a role in advising the client in presenting to the mediator, but also in advising the client as to what's the appropriate settlement and what view to take. It took me a long time to really understand how that relationship exists and what the roles are. I'm not sure, after spending an entire year with the FCA test case, I'm not sure I still understand that relationship, but it is, in a sense, a deferential one for the most part. The QC, or the barrister, is viewed as the expert, is viewed as the ultimate sort of person with the most sophistication in terms of their analytical ability. But yet at the same time, all the hard work is done by the solicitor. So all the preparatory work is done by the solicitor, but the barrister will present often at the mediation, depending on the client. And they are the ultimate ones kind of calling the shots about the view. You have to really understand that, I think. Again, it's that pre-work, making sure you've had a conversation with the parties that are involved, including potentially both the barrister and the solicitor. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the bigger picture. And I say that because the Lloyd's market, despite writing, in out of London, is a global market. And the decisions they make, they're very, very conscious, because so many players are often on a risk, because what happens is so public often, of what the impact is of a decision they're going to make in one mediation on other mediations. I think that's more than I've ever seen in the States. In the States, there tends to be more of a focus on the particular claim. In the London market, there's a lot of conversation. The results are shared publicly. Syndicate and managing agent results are published. They're aggregated, but they're published as an aggregated view from Lloyd's, but they're also published in terms of each agent's performance. And there's a high degree of visibility and transparency around results. And so that can play a part, because they're playing to an audience that may not be in the room with you when you're doing a mediation, and they're looking at the ramifications of outcomes that you may not be aware of or you may not perceive. So that's about it for my prepared remarks. I'm happy to answer questions, which I think would probably help, because there's so much I could talk about. I could go into more detail, and there's so much I don't know that I'm still learning. And I've always felt every mediation is a bit different because of the dynamics, the human dynamics, which don't change at all. But every set of humans has a different sort of objective about what they're trying to achieve. And I'm not sure the London market is any different than anywhere else in the world in that sense.
Thank you, Grace. That was terrific. Let me start off with a couple of questions. First of all, in terms of the behavior of mediators in mediation, with all of this stuff going on behind the scenes, things we as mediators, we may not be aware of these things. And if we're a United States mediator, there may be cultural issues. Typically, as mediators, we think our job is to get the case settled that day, if at all reasonably possible. So there are some, what we might call evaluative techniques, sometimes pressure techniques. Are those kinds of techniques advisable when dealing with the complexities of the players in the London market? And if not, what kind of techniques from mediators are effective in generating progress with the kinds of players you're describing?
I mean, it again, like all things, in all mediations, it depends in part on the type of claim. So Lloyd's the Lloyd's market can write a small risk, it can write a big risk, right? So in a small risk, you may very well be as effective if you just simply deploy the same techniques you would in any American mediation, because the authority levels are probably pretty low and the person in front of you may have them. It's as the scale of value, increases, that I think the complexity increases. I would think that you could expect to settle a smaller claim in your mediation that day. The bigger and more complex it is, I think there should be some expectation that if it's going to be that day, you've done pre-work. And I think it's highly unlikely it'll be done that day if it's complex, because the lead might have a second lead. There may be other parties on the slip that even if they're the lead, they may want to have a conversation with. They might come prepared with authority, but they can't come prepared with authority if they don't have a clear idea of the range of values. So if you're going to bracketing, I know is done quite a bit and it can be quite effective. But if you're going to do that, I do that in advance, because then you're not stuck with them going, well, I got to call 20 people, before I before I can move. There's a certain deference that I think the London market will play to counsel, so you can use counsel effectively that way in the pre-work, meaning their local counsel or whoever they're designated to act on their behalf. And in that way, you can kind of get it in a range and then go forward. But I think if you're starting really far apart, it'd be hard to do that in that time.
Before we open it up to others, let me ask one more question about the pre-work. Typically, Grace, we as mediators get a mediation brief or mediation statement, as they're called in different places, and they're signed by lawyers from outside law firms. And generally speaking, those are the only people we can figure out we ought to call. And when we call them, what should we be asking them? And should we be making an effort to speak to other people operating behind the scenes before the mediation, or would that be considered gauche to try to get beyond the lawyers who've sent us briefs?
I mean, I don't think it's gauche at all. I think one of the first things you need to ascertain is this is there more than one underwriter on the risk or not? So if there's one underwriter, then you're more likely to get in the room and settle the claim in a more normal way. If they have multiple carriers, multiple parties on the risk, that's an important question to ask. It's important to ask who's the lead. It may be worthwhile knowing if there's a second lead, because if there's a second lead, you know that the lead can't just make the decision on their own. You should find out if there's a range of values, I think, in advance, if there's multiple capital providers on the risk, and see if the whoever's appearing has that authority from all of the other signers on the slip, or whoever the second lead is, or that there's a sense of there's agreement that the person coming to the table has a certain amount of authority and can act. And if they don't, you should know what the exceptions are. Well, yes, well, generally speaking, I can sell in this range, but I will still need to confirm it with, X, Y, and Z. It could be they can only commit a portion of it, could be just like, 2 or 3 insurers on a risk. I mean, they may each need to, have their own view. I think what can sometimes make it even more complicated is I shared sort of the Lloyd's view, but sometimes a company can be on a slip and they're not part of Lloyd's. So, I mean, you could have a Lloyd's portion of the slip and a non-Lloyd's portion of the slip. In fact, sometimes companies, recently, there was an exposure I looked at in my own company where we had written part of it as on syndicate paper and part of it on company paper. For us, it was easy because they all reported up into me, but in some instances, it's not always that easy. You might actually have 2 completely separate chains of authority with 2 completely different, outcomes or positions. So again, it's that pre-work, the mediation statement might be perfectly fine if it's one carrier, clear authority, the numbers are low, it may not be, and you need to know, I think to me, that would be important to find out, is this going to be enough?
Thank you. Grace, just to get behind the jargon for some people who may not be as familiar with it, tell us in a little more detail what the slip is.
I wish I could, they used to talk about, I'll explain as best as I can. It's literally like, it's like an addendum to a contract, the signing slip. And what happens is there's like a cover note, you might want to call it. And that cover note will say, we're insuring, XYZ Corporation for the 20 million excess of 10 million or the primary 5 million. And then attached to it are sort of like signature pages. And each company will go in and say, well, I'll take 20% of that risk. And then they sign and there's a stamp. And then some of them might even add in their own terms. They might say, well, I'll take 20% subject to this exclusion. And they may be the only capital on there that has that particular exclusion. And then what the broker's supposed to do is take all of that and eventually generate an insurance contract that reflects that. But often things go into dispute before that actual contract is, is finalized. And so that's often a challenge if in any kind of a coverage dispute.
How long does it take typically to get the contract finalized?
And sometimes it never gets finalized. I mean, it just can be a year. I think they've gotten better at that. They have now some standards where they're supposed to, get those out more quickly, but I just recently saw one and it was just a bunch of, you're trying to figure out exactly what did I insure here. And it's based on kind of a skeleton with a bunch of signatures attached to it. And somebody's the lead, and often who is the lead is important. The lead has a certain known capability. For instance, if their specialty is directors and officers liability, then they're the lead, then other syndicates or carriers who have less experience in that might feel more confident, signing on, because I know, this company's the lead. Just like Hiscox is known for sort of insuring, high-end, customers or certain types of risks like satellites. We don't write satellites on our own. Clearly we'd be writing that in conjunction with other people, but we have a team of experts in Germany, believe it or not, who that's what they do. They know how to adjust a loss arising when a satellite crashes or, and it's part of why that company may be the lead, is because they have that expertise. And that's important to know, because if they have that expertise, you as a mediator, I think, will be viewed more favorably if you are, again, more, up on the specifics of that particular claim and the nuanced parts of the underlying complexity, right?
Well, we have a question in the chat from Bina Dagar. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, on a related subject. Does Lloyd's have a proclivity to handle claims at the global level in London, or would, for example, mediations with US parties be handled in the US? or does it vary by managing agents? And then with a sub-question, how much does subject matter expertise play a role in selecting a mediator? And I suppose we should give that question a little of a 2021 twist and say in the age of Zoom and other online platforms, does it really matter where a mediator or anybody else happens to be located?
I don't think it matters where they're located. I think it's sort of, you have to understand, I mean, again, what is being mediated. So if it's a liability policy, for instance, and the underlying claim is being mediated, and we would be coming in as the insurer of the defendant, and it'd be wherever the venue is of that particular dispute. So if the venue is in the US, that mediation would take place in the US, and we would send somebody out from London to fly in. That's typically how Hiscox does it. One of our claims adjusters, claims underwriters, to be specific, would fly. I always get confused because in America there are claims adjusters, and in Lloyd's there are claims underwriters. But a claims underwriter would fly out and would participate in that mediation on our behalf. Conversely, if it's a coverage dispute and it's a large multinational and it's business written out of London, I would expect that would get mediated and arbitrated in London. But Bermuda, the same thing. In Bermuda, people tend to just, as I said, some policies have New York law. They would probably be mediated and arbitrated in the US. Some have UK. They would probably tend to be mediated or arbitrated in the UK. So I don't think there's a particular preference. It's more about where does the subject matter underlying the dispute arise. I think there is more of a, I mean, probably because I'm American, and actually the head of claims for Brit is American as well. So I think we're seeing more Americans being imported into the UK market, which is an interesting twist. And I think in part that has been because of the recognition that US companies have more experience with operational efficiency and with data and analytics maybe than the more traditional markets. As you know, Lloyd's is going through Blueprint 2, which is a whole initiative to make things more efficient. And that's candidly because they aren't and haven't been historically very efficient. So it'd be curious if a mediator from the US who had the sort of the gravitas and the goodwill and the trust of people in London, whether they might be used, particularly if they had an expertise. So I think that was the question too. Do we look to subject matter expertise? I think it'd be easier for a US mediator who was really good at D&O, for instance, to come in and do a mediation, in London. But I think my guess is you're probably going to see more mediations in the US with London participants, than you would see vice versa.
We have a hand raised from our friend Andrew Miller, who is in London, United Kingdom. So Andrew, if you would please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Grace, thank you very much indeed for that. So disclosure, I am a barrister. I like to comment that the solicitors do more work than the barrister comes in. That's often the case, but not always. But I've jumped ship, so I'm now a mediator. And just before I forget, thanks to us now mediating remotely, I have now mediated in the States, and there is a reason for that, and it's attached to the insurance. So to give the disclosure, my practice as a barrister for the best part of over 25 years, I would say over 80% of my work was provided by insurers directly or via solicitors. And so I'm a very big fan of insurers. You see, I'm caveating this. They put my kids through school, they paid my holidays and my mortgage, etc. And as a result of having that practice, I would say about 80% of my mediations have insurers involved in the London market or sometimes worldwide. The London market involvement was what took me to the States on 2 occasions recently, or not recently, in the last few months, in terms of that. And so I have a familiarity with everything you're talking about, and why I was so interested to tune in, having given all those caveats and assured you that I'm a big fan of insurers, is I think, and I know because I've given it to many insurers, is the real talk is what the London insurance market should know about mediation. And although insurers are certainly friends of mediation, that is largely because they are enemy of litigation, or they have a fear of litigation. And so the one thing they do, most insurers will be doing, is avoiding their case ending up in litigation. But my experiences, and there are exceptions, and Grace, you clearly are that exception, there are many in the Lloyds building and in other buildings throughout London who do not really understand the process, and dare I say, don't have an interest in fully understanding the process. And I think mediation is incredibly simple in that it really has, there's only one aim of mediation, and that is to settle disputes. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't grasped that, if you think it's going to be a fencing match, if you think you're coming along as the insurer just as a spectator that many do, despite holding the checkbook, then you don't really get that you should be part of this game and playing in the negotiation. And the biggest problem that I have, and I actually put a post on LinkedIn very recently, and it applies to not just insurers but others, I posed a question of, do I need to be at the mediation? And I would say it is more often than not, if there is an issue as to who is at the mediation, I suddenly find out the insurer is missing. And that doesn't make any sense. And the analogy I give at media, I actually have now always preliminary meetings before the main day, but I'm often asked, do I need to be there? I've got a barrister, I've got a solicitor, whatever. You know, what I say is, for me, allowing my kids, now I'm getting on in life, be allowing my kids to handle my finances. Why would I do that? I've still got all my Compass mentors, and just getting over to insurers. It's your money. This is your day, to have your day to be part of getting a settlement of the dispute of your claim seems to be quite a difficult thing. And so I say, and I say it with affection and whatever. And I've actually been throughout London. I've given many talks actually in-house to insurers. For me, if you said what's the one thing that needs to change, it needs to be the and I understand the overlap sometimes there is between underwriters and claims managers, but for me, I'll call them claims managers. It needs to be claims managers who really want to get involved in the settlement of their claim. And
Andrew, let me pose it to Grace, if I may, let me pose it to Grace. Of
course.
Grace, is there a reluctance among Lloyd's claims underwriters, claims managers to participate directly in mediations? And has that changed in the online era when people don't have to get on airplanes and people can do it from the comfort of their homes or offices, if people dare to go into their offices, and we can have them intermittently participate during the day? What's your view?
I mean, first, I think it will change somewhat based on the availability of Zoom. I know I participated myself in a mediation recently. I would not have been able to simply, but I did because I could do other work while I was sitting in the room, as opposed to being locked up with the coffee machine, forced to wait until the mediator came back to me. I think, Andrew probably knows more about London market than I do, it sounds like. My sense of it, and I'm an outsider, is that it's changing. And it's changing because it has to. So there is sort of what I would call the old school, the old guard that would never go to mediation, doesn't view it as productive, and doesn't see that it could actually, I view mediation sometimes, by the way, as strategic. I will often recommend a mediation because I learn about what the other party thinks about the case and how they view it, their value of it, and it gives me information I can go take away and then make a decision. So cases often, as you know, settle after mediation, right? Because people have a different view. They may not be ready at that moment, but they have more. But the new generation is much more engaged. So I know the team that I have at Hiscox, I mean, we go to mediations all the time. Sometimes it's been hard because they're in London, and for them to go to California, that's not going to happen. But with Zoom, maybe it will happen. It's the same as, you know, if you don't have the time and now you're at home all day, it may be a lot easier for you to drop in every now and then to a mediation. Or you had pointed out to me, Jeff, that now the more senior you are, you don't have to sit through the whole thing. You can schedule it with the mediator and check in and be there at the important times to make decisions. And I think the flexibility around engaging people is important. And to me, if I were a mediator, which I'm not, and I don't actually plan on doing that, I'm not anywhere near as patient as I know you guys are. I would be inclined to force people to my way of thinking. You know, I think that's a way to entice people to participate. You know, I mean, it's a selling job too, right? Like, hey, if you do this, it could help you resolve your claim. It could help you learn more about your claim. You don't have to spend 10 hours here. And that's conversations with, you know, the decision makers. I'm curious, you know, Andrew, and I know this is not you speaking, but the couple of mediations I had with British mediators were very different from the American ones that I went through. I mean, the British mediators seem to take an early view of the claim, which I didn't really see in American, at least my experience generally with mediators in the US is they're fairly balanced because they're trying to get you to move towards the center. So they're trying hard not to come in on one side or the other. But the two that I had in the UK that I was personally in, the mediator had a view and was like, "This is the way I think it should be." And is that normal? Is that
I could probably name that mediator. So I think, you know, you probably had a very established mediator, very old school mediator, or you had a mediator who wasn't that good. It's one of the two. I would say the good mediators would not do that. I think it's, you know, the key for me as a mediator is keeping the balance very, very much. I think what's changed with mediation, and I certainly is the way I mediate, is driving the mediation forward that not everyone wants, and insurers don't necessarily seem to like. And by that I mean being active. You know, you are effectively pushing or dragging them to the trough. You can't make them drink because ultimately it's them. But I believe very much in keeping the mediation going actively rather than simply taking an offer from one room to the other. So if you get an offer which is ridiculous, you debate it rather than simply taking it. But in terms of the contrast, what which I found most interesting, because I've had 3 interactions with lawyers attorneys in the States, I have noticed a difference. And so what I had, and it may not apply. The States is huge, and you know, mine was in 2 different areas. And in fact, I also had one in Canada. I found that the recipients to mediation were far more receptive to the process of mediation in the US and Canada than many of the recipients or the participants in mediation in London. And that doesn't just include insurers, it includes lawyers as well.
Yeah.
But it is, for me, part of it is what I come back to. It's this education thing. I think here, and I think that I do see this as a possible distinction. The insurance industry puts so much faith in the lawyers, and I saw less of that in the US. They saw it was their money, and they didn't care what the lawyers were going to do. They knew they had to get a settlement, or they didn't want a settlement, one of the two. But it was very much, they were very firm about it. Whereas here, what you said about, it's your money. Why are you letting barristers and solicitors run the show when you can make this decision? And I think that's the problem with that, is a large thing to the lack of education about mediation throughout the market. Again, I say it with love and affection.
Yeah, there was a question someone posed on the chat about paying for mediation. Let me just see if
the questions in the chat, Grace, there's from Anthony Sendall and Joanne Selleck, similar questions about the willingness of the insurance representatives themselves, building on what Andrew was just discussing, the willingness of the insurance representatives themselves to participate in conversation, either directly with the mediator or sometimes with folks on the other side of the aisle in the mediation. Yeah, is there resistance to that?
I would say there's more resistance to that, and it goes back to what Andrew was saying, and it was interesting. And again, I had my own experience recently, being very, very engaged in what was going on here. I was really the only one who ever questioned the barrister or the lawyer, and everyone else in my team who was more, who had been in London market longer, was much more inclined to just accept at face value the legal advice that they were given. As it turned out, I was actually more on the money as to what was going to happen than they were, but I was bringing a very American point of view, and ironically, it turned out, in this instance, that was probably the more accurate view of what the outcome was going to be. There was a question about paying for mediations, and I don't know that there is any standard. I know what I prefer. I'm not sure if the London market has a preference, probably because when they engage, it's usually either a US-based mediation or it's rare. My preference is a flat fee, and I say that because of the pre-work, the after work. I'd rather pay a robust amount to a mediator and have him work hard to resolve my claim and do what's needed, to sit here and think about, hours, because I think with hours, then, maybe the mediator is reluctant to run up the hours, or maybe they might be too eager to run up hours. And I'd rather that we're working from sort of the same place, which is, here's the number. So, I've paid some pretty hefty fees on some D&O mediations. I don't know if any of you are on the line, big, huge numbers per day. And I'm not terribly in favor of those, but they do tend to get the job done at times, perhaps just the sheer gravitas in the area that they're in. But my preference is always a flat fee. And that's not because I'm just trying to save a ton of money. It's because I'd rather allow the mediator to feel free to do the work they need to get the claim resolved.
Okay, Jean, I want to give you a chance to pose a question or two if you wish. Jean, you had quite a distinguished career as an insurance litigator before turning yourself with great distinction to the mediation profession a couple of years ago. I want to give you a chance to ask a question or two.
Oh, well, thanks. Surprise here. It's been fantastic having you on this, Grace. I just love the London market, and I love being in London, and it's been a hard year not being able to be there. And it's Thursday, where should you be tonight, right? One thing that I've seen when I have mediations where there is US lawyers who are representing London carriers, and maybe it's a carrier versus carrier dispute, like allocation or something. Do you find that the London representatives would be available even though they're sending their American lawyers? And I know you've got, monitoring counsel, coverage counsel, defense counsel. I've served in all three of those roles when I was in practice, and so what would you say would be the best way try and ensure that day can be productive? Anything in particular?
I'm a great believer in just asking blunt questions. Do you have the authority? What's the scope of your role? Because the role of monitoring counsel can vary dramatically. There's monitoring counsel. We have monitoring counsel, for instance, in certain lines, and they're literally just a filter. They kind of just pass information back, and then if it's a a matter of more importance, then we'll hire someone who's more closely monitoring, which sounds just so strange, and it's incredibly costly, which is something I'm looking at. But I do think that's worth asking, because if you can't speak to the client, or you can't get a clear answer, then that tells you the client's not engaged. You know, the mixture of, you know, where people are on that journey to be more modern in London is, it's all over the place. I mean, some companies are ahead of the game, some are back, you know, 30 years. I mean, I just had an interesting conversation with someone just even about claims data. And I said, you know, we collecting data on, you know, how often we mediate, how often do things go into litigation, you know, what's, you know, shouldn't we be preventing this? And you know, they're like, oh, that data is not important. And it, you know, and it was on the underwriting side, but the underwriting side is hugely influential in London market. And again, it's a journey, but just like what COVID taught me, when I started 2 years ago, I was an outlier. I mean, I was, you know, Sheila and I I mean, people would listen to me and be very polite. And basically it was like, you're an American, Grace. You don't know what you were talking about. And then, you know, when the FCA test case started in the very beginning, I mean, I managed that. Obviously, it was my claims department. And I was very involved with the lawyers and the barristers. And it was a bit more of that. Well, Grace, you don't know what you're talking about. And that's changed. Really changed. And I think, you know, Lloyd's slow to adopt certain changes, said they couldn't go digital, had to go digital in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So to me, mediation serves an important function. I'm a great believer in it, you know, and I mean, you guys obviously are part of what makes it possible. And it's really up to us to demonstrate that it can effectively resolve claims and reduce cost, because there's a cost to continue. Even if you ultimately are scared of litigation, you're scared of the outcome, there's a cost to get there. And London is paying that cost. The cost of external lawyers is extremely high relative to indemnity. And if some commitment and investment and resolution, you know, some effort to resolve it short of litigation, where you can still, you know, view your opponent's arguments and you can present your own. I mean, I think, again, there's value in that, even if it doesn't actually resolve the dispute. It gives you information, and people should do it more often. So I'm a huge advocate, and my time is up, I see. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you, because I know you serve such an important function in terms of facilitating things. And I'll do what I can, Andrew, but it's
Grace, this was just terrific. So much information for everyone. Thank you very much. I hope that people on the line who are in a position to contribute to the Trussell Trust in your honor do so. And if you're comfortable, those of you who can contribute, if you're comfortable letting Natalie know that you've made the contribution, we'll be delighted to add it to our running total. We've broken through the $70,000 barrier, and we're just zooming towards $100,000 to fight food insecurity. And it's thanks to great speakers like you, Grace, for sharing your time with us. Jean, thank you so much for being part of the Will Work for Food team and working on the organization presentation of these great webinars. Natalie, thank you so much for establishing the Will Work for Food project last spring and doing so much work to help fight food insecurity through these great webinars and otherwise. Thank you all very much for being here. And with that, we thank Grace once again. We are complete.